This episode of Tales from Atlantis is brought to you by Atlantis Premium. Don't you just hate having your favorite podcast interrupted by ads like this? Well, dear listener, you're in luck. Because starting at just $3 a month, you can support independent Chicano media and receive ad-free episodes, premium episodes, bonus content, and access to our Discord server. Just visit talesfromatlantis.com and click Go Premium, or follow the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so.
Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to yet another episode of Tales from Atlantis. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa
and Ruben Ariano Tlacatecat.
So today we have a special guest. I'm very excited for today's show. Joining us is Dr. Jennifer Raff. Jennifer Raff is an associate professor of anthropology and affiliate faculty member of the Indigenous Studies program at the University of Kansas. She has a PhD in anthropology and biology. Show off. From Indiana University, and has been studying the genomes of ancient and contemporary indigenous peoples from North America since 2001. Her new book, Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas, is a New York Times bestseller. So welcome, Dr. Raff, and congratulations on the bestseller. That's awesome.
Thank you so much. It still hasn't really sunk in, so I'm going to somebody else, but it's exciting.
So how does that happen? Do they call you or do you get like, it just pops up online on some list?
I got an email from my publisher and I was in the middle of a meeting on, it was on public scholarship at the university, right? So I'm on this, in this wonderful program where we're trying to encourage public scholarship. So I'm in this panel and we're talking about this and that. And then all of a sudden this email flashes across and I'm like, it was really funny. I think I really freaked out.
That's awesome. Do they send you like a plaque or something?
No, but I did pay a ridiculous amount of money to get a book review printed and framed and, like a nice plaque on that. So nice. I paid for that. Yeah.
So I first became aware of your work, I think in 2016. You had done a talk at Skepticon and I caught it on video. It was the misuse of genetics in pseudoscience. And since pseudoscience and pseudohistory and pseudoarchaeology, that's kind of like my jam. I was like, oh, wow, I got to watch this. And it was a great talk. And then I heard I think you appeared on Archaeofantasies, the Archaeofantasy podcast. And so I was like, oh, wow, I wonder if she's on social media. So that's when I friended you. I like on Twitter or something. I followed you. But yeah, the talk was great. And in the talk at Skepticon, you refer to what you called pseudogenetics. I was wondering if you can explain, what do you mean by that? What is pseudogenetics?
I don't know if that's the best word, but I was kind of riffing off of pseudoarchaeology, right? So like, how do you use genetics to support pseudoarchaeological ideas or pseudohistorical ideas? And, we see, unfortunately, all too many examples of that. And they range from kind of the wackiest, right? Which are like, I don't know, gosh, it's been a while since I thought about this, but like DNA from aliens or angels or whatever, Nephilim.
Yeah, the Nephilim.
Yeah, that's always fun. So like that sort of thing to, stuff that legitimate archaeologists are putting out there, but is not supported by the data at all, like the Solutrean hypothesis. There was a paper a while back that argued that haplogroup X, which is one found in indigenous peoples of North America at kind of low frequencies, right? There was an argument that was evidence for the Solutrean hypothesis, because of course you see haplogroup X lineages in Europe as well, but of course they are not ancestral to the ones found in North America.
Yeah. Well, for our listeners who don't know, what is the Solutrean hypothesis?
Yeah, sorry. So the Solutrean hypothesis is this idea that the Solutrean culture in Europe, which dates to, oh God, I didn't prepare the dates, Upper Paleolithic sometime.
Yeah.
Okay. It predates Clovis by quite a bit. And the argument is that because Solutrean projectile points are bifacially flaked using this overshot technique. Mm-hmm. I don't really know what that means, but you can explain it. And so are Clovis points, which of course date to about 13,000 years in North America, that there's an ancestor-descendant relationship between them. And so therefore, Solutrean Clovis points were actually, the technology was actually brought by Europeans migrating across the Atlantic. And yeah. There are a lot of
Was this before or after the aliens introduced the technology to the Solutreans?
I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure. I guess I probably after. I don't know.
So what part of Europe would this have been, the Solutrean culture?
They were, oh God, I'm sorry, I didn't come prepared for this. They were in Western Europe. So like, I want to say Iberia.
Yeah, it was Iberian peoples. It's funny. One of my mentors at the University of New Mexico was Dr. Lawrence Strauss, whose main area of expertise is Iberia. And man, if you wanted to get out of homework or the lecture, just bring up the Solutrean hypothesis, and that guy would just go off for like the entire class. But it was super informative because he knew how to just dissect it and tell you everything that was wrong with the Solutrean hypothesis.
Yep. So there's arguments against it from an archaeological perspective. There's, and then there's also arguments against it for a genetic perspective. And so Deborah Bolnick, my postdoc mentor, and I wrote a paper refuting that. And it actually became pretty well cited, which I was surprised about because I mostly wrote it because I was pissed off.
So we can confirm that the Solutrean hypothesis is pretty much dead at this point.
Well, there are people who still believe it. I do not. The vast majority just find it to be
well in terms of like people who are serious about their work, not these pseudohistorians, pseudoarchaeologists that want to continue to massage their pit theory. With serious scholars, it's pretty much dead.
There are a couple of serious archaeologists who still
really
one of them is even associated with the Smithsonian, which is such a
are you
drag.
he
serious?
passed away.
Did he?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So but there are still others who maintain that it's a viable explanation. But I would say they're in the minority of North American archaeologists for sure. But it's interesting because, and then they try and marshal genetic evidence to support it, which is just, and I can get into why it doesn't support it. And so that's been going on and kind of pisses me off. I mean, I guess I shouldn't bring my emotions into this whole field because that's one of the problems with our field, right? Is that we all get attached to our ideas.
You have to be dispassionate about your work.
Yeah, but I do feel passionate about this.
Yeah, so, you can't help but be. I mean, this podcast is like a manifestation of our passion about our work. So I want to, talk about specifically some stuff that you go over in your book, because the book, first of all, the book is great. I really enjoyed it. It's very accessible. Like, it's not, a lot of times you get these, especially about genetics, right? You get a book about genetics and it's just going to be so dense and so impenetrable that, I just read the back of the the back of the book, the blurb, and be like, I'm not going to understand anything in this book. But your book is written very plainly.
And it's very personal, too. I mean, you bring yourself into it and you explain thoroughly the different mechanisms and processes that are at play in terms of the genetics and how things are done. And you do a really good job of blending both the academic approach and also a more sort of layman's approach to the scholarship that you're working on.
Oh, thank you guys. You're making me blush, really. The audience can't see it, but I am turning red.
Well, one of my favorite quotes, and I want to attribute it to Malcolm X, but I'm not sure if he said it, but there's this quote that I like to use a lot that just says, make it plain. And that's always been like what I try to do with my writing, right? Just make it plain. Don't write in like this obtuse fashion with all of these all the nomenclature of
the jargon.
Field. Yeah, all the jargon. That's the word I was looking for.
Well, we definitely, right, in our field, at least in anthropology anyways, really fetishize the jargon, right? And it has its place. It really does when you're communicating scholar to scholar, right? You know, I think it can be important, but that's not who I wrote the book for.
Yeah, this is very accessible to the general public, which is good because the public needs to know about this.
Yeah.
As a historian, I teach American history, and in the first half of American history, we always start with Native people before contact, before the European arrival. And I try to explain these things to students from the very beginning. I tell them these conversations are still taking place. Nothing is set in stone. Indigenous people have their own versions of who they are as a people, where they come from, their origins. Scholars, they have scientific approaches, and these two things don't have to be in conflict. They can be in conversation. And the science is always evolving, and it's also correcting itself. And so because something is true scientifically now doesn't mean that it's going to be true a year down the road or 5 years down the road.
Oh yeah, definitely. I agree. And I think that's fantastic that you teach that. It's funny because when I was working on this, like, I really struggled with trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to talk about these scientific approaches in a way that's respectful of Indigenous histories, right? Differ. I mean, sometimes they don't differ, right? But sometimes they do. And like, how do you talk about that? And I think a lot of my non-Native colleagues would just kind of shy away from it, or okay, like one sentence, like, okay, this is, here's what we're talking about. But like, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to really talk about it more throughout and kind of hold space for all these different perspectives on the past, even while saying, okay, look, I'm a scientist and here's the data that I have. But also like pointing out, archaeologists do not agree about interpreting the archaeological record at all. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of hilarious. So like, I'm going to the SAAs for the first time in forever, the Society for American Archaeology meeting for the first time in forever. And I am really looking forward to the lively discussions we're going to have about, like, say, the White Sands site, right? And
for sure.
So that's going to be interesting. I say, people can look at the same data sets and come up with different interpretations, right?
It's the same in history.
So we do that already in science. Yeah, we do that already in science. You guys do that in history. And so I don't see, a reason to ignore the fact or minimize the fact that Indigenous peoples have their own histories. And I try to call them histories, not origin stories, right? Because I think that kind of minimizes it. But at the same time, how do we present all this in an integrated way? I don't know how to do it. But.
So Ruben had brought up teaching. And I remember when I was in school, nice segue. You like that segue there, Ruben? So when I was in school, I remember learning about the Bering Strait, right? And I think most people, I don't know, we're probably all around the same age here, more or less. We probably heard the same story about the Bering Strait, about the peopling of the Americas. But I was wondering if you could go into a little bit about how was it that people first even became interested in the peopling of the Americas, right? Like people who tried to explain, all these Europeans landed here and they're like, holy shit, who are all these people that we're seeing? What sparked their interest and what are the different ideas that they had?
Yeah, great. So well, that's exactly what they were like. They were like, holy shit, these people aren't on the Bible.
Yeah.
What does that mean, right? Yeah. And so I think there were multiple perspectives who, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes here, Indians were, right? And all kind of, they were all underlaid by like really ridiculous racism, like really horrible racism. And so a lot of the perspectives were on, okay, well, here's these people. We don't know who they are, but obviously there were people here earlier because we see these beautiful mounds. We see these beautiful, in South America and Central America, we see, structures that are made up, whatever. So, and beautiful artwork. Okay, well, Indians couldn't have made these, so it must have been people before that, right? And then they were wiped out by the Indians. And so that gives us a justification for taking land, right? That was one of the justifications. And it's very, very, I mean, I don't have to tell you guys, but I'm sure I don't know if all listeners know this, but I did write about it in my book. This was one of Andrew Jackson, specifically cites the mound builder hypothesis, which is this idea of a lost race in the Indian Removal Act and his justification for that, right? He explicitly cites it. And that's really, if anybody doubts that these ideas of aliens or Solutreans or whoever, right, are coming in and we're here before Indigenous peoples, like if they doubt that that's harmful, I just point them back to this. I say, look, this is the history.
There seems to be a disconnect between the Anglophone world and the Hispanophone world in this, because Jose Acosta, you mentioned him in your book, and I encountered him when I was doing my doctoral work as well. He was the very first person that, as you say, was looking at it from a biblical perspective, because everything was based on the Bible. If it's in the Bible or if it's not, and they were checking to make sure that indigenous people were mentioned, and if not, why not? And how could we explain it, right? And so Acosta is the first one that begins to say, well, perhaps these people were originally from Asia and they migrated through what is now called the Bering Strait, along those lines in that part of the world. And he was saying this very early on in the 1500s. And then we have a disconnect that takes place. And then here we fast forward to Thomas Jefferson, who in his notes in Virginia being famous for many things, one of the things is that he's kind of credited as being the person that starts the white supremacist rhetoric here in the United States, right, in that book. And one of the things that he's doing also, he's trying to explain, because he's responding to those European scholars who denigrate anything that comes from the Americas, right? It's less than, it's not as equal to, it's inferior to anything that's European. And so he's responding to those people, right? And there's a disconnect. He's trying to come up with an idea. And he also has it kind of independently. He says, well, there had to have been some kind of migration from the old world. And so I'm thinking that there seems to be this disconnect between what people in the Spanish-speaking world were doing versus what the English world were doing, that there's a lack of communication taking place, because these conversations were already being had. And so by the time you come to the Mormons, who are positing that Jesus walked among the Indians, who were one of the lost tribes of Israel, there seems to have been all this previous knowledge that was forgotten. And it seems like we were kind of reinventing the wheel. So can you explain what is going on there with the difference between the two spheres of knowledge?
I don't know that I have a good explanation for it. I mean, I'm not a historian of science, so I feel like I'm even outside of my area, right? It strikes me that the mound builder hypothesis is just so popular just because it's so convenient, right? At least in North America, right? It partitions indigenous peoples into this role of another immigrant group, right? And gives settlers an excuse to remove them from their lands and to take their lands and use it better, right, for farming, and also to relegate their ancestors to the realm of natural history as opposed to ancestors, right? So I'm sure that contributes to the appeal of this idea and among scientists, because these were the leading scientists of the day believed this, right? But as to why it's different in North America than South America, I don't know. I mean, honestly, like I'm really hyper-focused on the United States or present-day United States, and I'm really ignorant of the line in South America. I mean, I have Da Costa in my book, but, not enough. I don't.
Right.
So this is something I would love to read somebody write a book about. Why don't you write a book about this?
That's our next book.
Yeah, do it.
Well, so when we talk about Beringia, right, because like Ruben just mentioned, there was this idea like, well, these people had to come from somewhere. And what I've noticed, most people conflate Beringia with the ice-free corridor. They mix up the two. So when they hear criticism of the ice-free corridor, they're like, oh yeah, so the Bering Strait theory's been debunked. Like that's always the answer, the thing that I hear. And I'm like, well, they're two different things. I was wondering if you could explain for our listeners the difference between Beringia and the ice-free corridor.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Have you picked up your Mexica calendar for the year 12 Flint? Or how about a paperback copy of The Four Disagreements? Just visit talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise and show some love for your favorite podcast. That's talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, I have some trouble with this because, in my book, I start by critiquing the Clovis, what we call Clovis first theory, right? The idea that this Clovis techno-complex that represents the material culture of the very first peoples of the America, right? 13,000 years ago, that they came across the Bering Land Bridge very quick, very late, just in time to get to the North America by at most 14, maybe 13,000 years ago. And as you say, down an ice-free corridor. So I am a critic, obviously, of that. In fact, most archaeologists and most geneticists are as well. But and I don't think that model has been debunked for decades. in archaeology. Now, there's still some holdouts. There's still some archaeologists who believe it's the most plausible explanation. But for most of us, it's not really the way we think about the peopling of the Americas. But it somehow has gotten conflated with what I see people calling the Bering Strait theory, right? And I'm looking over at my book review on the wall because the headline that, okay, and this is not the author's fault. He did an amazing, wonderful, I love the review of my book. Oh my God.
I wanted to talk about that headline.
I was stunned when I read it, like just literally sat. Okay, I promise this is going somewhere. So the headline is, did the first Americans, okay, now I can't read it.
It's did the first Americans arrive via land bridge?
Yes.
This geneticist says no.
Yes.
And when I read that, I was like, oh, God damn it.
I know. So obviously I didn't write that headline and I know the author didn't write that headline. It's always an editor who does this. And I'm not faulting the editor for that, but I do think that it gives a more sensational, controversial take to what my book is really about.
You got to have clicks.
Yeah. It did get like, it got clicks. Oh boy. Yeah. You should read the comments. I had to stop.
It's all about the click.
It's all about the clicks, right? Well, okay. So yes, I do argue the simplistic notion of the Bering Land Bridge being a simple, land bridge, right? That people raced across. What I argue, and I'm perfectly happy to be wrong about this, but what I argue is something that a lot of archaeologists and geneticists have been doing for a while, is that the ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas were not just racing across Beringia, but they were living in Beringia for an extended period of time, several thousands of years. And we know that they were isolated because their genomes show us this. Models of their genomes show us that isolated for a couple of thousand years away from everybody else. During that period that you see the emergence of genetic variants present only in the first peoples and nowhere else in the world, except maybe a little bit in Siberia where there was some back I wouldn't call back migration, but migration.
Yeah, people were moving back and forth.
Yeah, people were moving back and forth a lot. Yeah. So, and then one of the environmental reconstructions of Beringia show that like the southern coast of central Beringia, the part that's underwater right now, would have had a relatively decent climate during the last glacial maximum, during the height of the last glacial maximum, that there were plants there were animals there was warmer environment, there were marine resources, right? So it was a pretty decent place to hang out when you're talking about desert, cold conditions everywhere else in the Northern Hemisphere. And so, we don't have direct archaeological evidence of people being there because it's underwater, but it's a really plausible hypothesis to test. And so that's, for me right now, that's my favorite hypothesis. That's the one I think the evidence supports, or at least it's one that I want to go out and see if we can ground truth it, right, with archaeological data. That's not the same thing as saying people didn't come from somewhere else.
Yeah, and that's how it's interpreted, right? People. Yeah,
I know.
And that's the first thing I got was hate mail. People writing to me saying, "See, I told you, Kurly, the Bering Land Bridge is a myth."
I heard similar stories.
I'm sorry. I really didn't. I would not have phrased the headline that way, and I know the author wouldn't have either. On the other hand, I'm arguing against a simplistic model that very few people in our field believe anymore. And I'm just putting that out there.
Well, even the idea, even the phrase Bering Land Bridge builds this image in most people's minds of something very narrow, right? That they just kind of sped across, when in reality, Beringia was massive. It was like...
Yeah, twice the size of Texas. Yeah, huge. Yeah.
And...
It's funny you say that, because when I was a kid, I remember one of the social studies books in elementary, when they talked about Beringia, like they had an image of like people actually chasing game through Beringia. So when you say this, it conjures up those images from back then. Oh,
yeah. And that they got, into basically Eastern Beringia would be like modern Alaska, sort of. Yeah. And absolutely. That's when see if I can remember, was it the Laurentide and the Cordilleran ice sheets separate, and that creates the ice-free corridor that they, as the hypothesis went, they came down this ice-free corridor. But most people confuse the two things. Like it was this happened and then this happened. Right. And now we're like, well, actually, that's not even how it happened at all.
Yeah.
Well, which one came first? Was it Beringia or was it the ice-free corridor?
Well, I'll let Dr. Raff answer that.
Beringia, I think, because Da Costa argued that people came, right? Or maybe he thought they were using boats. No, he said land connection. I think he said land connection.
Yeah, he said land connection.
As far as constructing the theory. So anyway, it's unfortunate. And I don't mean to, I really, really don't mean to minimize traditional histories of coming from whatever land they're,
absolutely.
From, right? So, one can look at it metaphorically. One can look at it as a tribe really literally coalesced and had their identity, right, forming in this space.
Ethnogenesis.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. But it's not my place to say, right? I'm a white woman. I'm an outsider. I don't have a way to reconcile these things. I'm not going to. I just try to talk about it respectfully and say, let's be open to all kinds of knowledge, right? But as far as genetics goes, indigenous peoples of the Americas have ancestry from in Siberia and East Asia. And so can we construct a model that accounts for the biological and the archaeological evidence, right? And so what I want to argue is that Beringia was not a land bridge. I mean, it was a land bridge, but it wasn't a bridge in the sense that people raced across it. It was a homeland. People lived there, right, for generations and generations. And probably, maybe part of this is that they became acculturated and adaptations to marine resources while they're living there. And that facilitated then travel down the West Coast.
Yeah, the Kelp Highway hypothesis, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about that, the Kelp Highway?
The Kelp Highway hypothesis is this idea that people would have moved much more rapidly, first of all, than they would have overland. And that fits the data better, the archaeological and the genetic data better, which show evidence of variation. It goes along with the observation that coastal regions have similar resources, right? And so if you're adapted to coastal resources, you can expect to find similar resources everywhere you go. And it's consistent and it's plentiful. It's abundant, nutrition from kelp and other marine resources. And that these are present all along, not just the west coast of the Americas, but also, the southern coast of Beringia, and then presumably the east coast of Asia. And so there's a connection there that facilitates travel. Now, I'm not one of the people, so I think the Kelp Highway hypothesis, I'm all about it. I think it's great. I'm not one of those people who say that indigenous peoples have their ancestry in like the Jomon they do have East Asian ancestry, but I don't think specifically the Jomon culture. We don't see that genetically, but there's a lot more work to be done, I think. So.
And so to come down the West Coast relatively quickly, right? Because that would be easier than walking over the land, because a lot of it was just ice locked, right? Like just covered by these massive ice sheets. So are you saying that the ice sheets receded first along the West Coast?
Yes, I guess I should have said that earlier. Yeah. Well, we see that happening, at least I am told by paleoclimate folks, that it starts, about 17, maybe 16,000 years ago, which is the melting back of the ice sheet, the receding of the ice sheets along the coast, the West Coast. And that in the interior, the ice-free corridor then opens up much later, like maybe after 14,000 years ago. There has been some genetics work done that shows, so environmental DNA from the center of the corridor shows that it would not have been viable. So there weren't any plants or animals living there until much later, like 13-ish thousand years ago. Mm-hmm. Some archaeologists have pushed back on that and said, well, they didn't need food. They could shoot birds or bring them or whatever. But then one of my colleagues, Scott Elias, points out, well, if you're traveling through an ice-free corridor, center of North America, and everything's melting, it would have been horrible to walk through, lakes and like bogs. And that is not an easy, you could not have gone quickly. And that seems to be at odds with what we see in the genetics record, which is very, very rapid diversification, which is a signal of population movement quickly. And we also see, well, really the only archaeological evidence of movement through the corridor is movement northward.
Yeah.
Not southward, right? So, all the evidence really points to a West Coast migration. And we also have white sands. So how do we reconcile that? If it is a legitimate site, we have a lot of work to do to figure that out.
The white sands, what is that?
Yeah. So white sands, this paper got published just when I was finishing up the book. I was about ready to turn in my final draft, final doc.
And then you got a whole new chapter that you had to write.
Well, honestly, the way it happened was I knew the paper was coming because I had heard from one of the authors, and I was like, oh my God, okay, what do I do about this? So I go to Sean, what do I do? And he's like, well, you can put it in the introduction. And then I didn't have time to write an introduction. Like, I have an intro, but it wasn't what I was originally going to write. So I was up against a deadline. I ended up getting an advanced copy of the paper, and I got to read it, and that was cool. And so I was able to put a little bit of it in the book, but not as much as I wanted. But here's the story about White Sands. This is a site in New Mexico at the White Sands Park, which these footprints are found on the edge of a lake. And they span a period of about 2,000 years. So this is serious. These are a lot of human footprints and animal footprints, Pleistocene megafauna footprints. It was amazing. They're just all crisscrossing each other. And it dates incredibly to about 24-ish thousand years ago, somewhere in there, or 20 to 22,000 years, right smack in the middle of the peak of the last glacial maximum, when nobody is supposed to be in the Americas. Everybody is either in Beringia or maybe somewhere else in Siberia. And yet we have these footprints. It's human footprints with Pleistocene megafauna, and they're incredible. And they're like children's footprints. They're children and young adults, at least in this one part of the park. And they're showing kids doing kid stuff, like running around and jumping and, chasing each other and walking.
There's even adult footprints, and then you see kid footprints appear. Like if the adult was carrying the child and they set the child down, and the kid's running around, and then they pick him back up, and then it's just adult footprints again.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's you just can't, and so I knew these were coming. They'd been described to me. I was already thinking about, okay, how to settle this with genetic evidence, right? And then somebody sent me the paper. So I was kind of, in my intellectual mode. And then somebody sent me the paper, and I saw the pictures, and I kind of teared up, you guys. I don't want to I sound like a wimp, but I was really by them. They're amazing. It's one thing to just hear about them. It's another to see them. So I encourage everybody to go look at the pictures because they're just unbelievable.
Well, I know that.
Well, hear me out real quick. I'm sorry, Kurly. You've been trying to say something for a few minutes, but I'm going to drop the bombshell.
Uh-oh.
So you ever heard of American Genesis?
I haven't thought about that
By Jeffrey Goodman, PhD, the startling new theory that the first fully modern men made their world debut in North America. So that could explain White Sands. You never know. So I was wondering if we could take, I don't know if you want to do this now, but at some point, if you could explain the difference between what it means to be monogenetic and polygenetic, because that seems to be a very prevalent idea among certain people. I think I'm saying that right? Monogenetic and polygenetic? In the sense that there's some people believe that there's multiple origins for humanity, for Homo sapiens, polygenesis versus monogenesis, which kind of speaks to this book, right? American Genesis.
Yeah. Okay. So the idea that there's multiple origins for anatomically modern Homo sapiens, well, that's not consistent with the genetic or fossil records. So, genetically, all humans show clear ancestral origins in Africa. The fossil record supports this. So the earliest hominins are obviously from Africa. The earliest anatomically modern Homo sapiens are also from Africa. It looks like, and I'm going to venture into paleoanthropology here for a minute, and I'm going to probably get in trouble because I'm going to say this wrong, but it looks like there are multiple populations of anatomically modern Homo sapiens in different parts of Africa, that some of them have, various features that resemble ours, and some have various features that are more similar to earlier forms of humans, right? And so it's kind of a mosaic of features that you start to see appear in Africa. And it's really what we would expect when you see a complex, population history with different groups breeding with each other and kind of developing new features. And, that's how evolution works, right? It tests out different things to kind of advise it. And then it looks as though there were maybe a couple of migrations of anatomically modern Homo sapiens outside of Africa. We see a couple of examples in the fossil record of anatomically modern, or at least hominins that look like anatomically modern Homo sapiens kind of popping out a bit early here and there. But the genetic record shows pretty consistently that the earliest migration of humans was, of anatomically modern Homo sapiens was in one big migration, and that anatomically modern Homo sapiens don't get to Siberia until the Upper Paleolithic, and they really don't get above the Arctic Circle before 31,000 years ago, which is where we see these people at the Yana rhinoceros horn site in Siberia. And so, there have been names for really, really early sites in the Americas, but none of them have really held up to scrutiny. And so the one that's most recently been identified or proposed is the Cerruti Mastodon site in California. I don't know if you guys have covered this on your podcast before, but
no. Well, I mean, I think we've made jokes, passing jokes, but we haven't dug into it yet.
I mean, all right, I'm going to say for the millionth time, I'm not okay, but I did read the literature on Cerruti pretty closely, and I've talked to a lot of people about it. The site dates to about 130,000 years ago. Okay. It comes into the question of, is this actually evidence of an archaeological site, or is what they found at Cerruti could it be explained by natural processes, right? And so what they found was, it was a mastodon tusk that had been fractured in such a way that looked like it was like a green stick fracture. It looked like it was modified by humans, or broken in a way that humans would have done. And then some rocks that maybe were there, right? And a couple of things.
They might have been hammerstones, but
help me out, Kurly.
Not really.
Okay. So there were there's a couple things. Now, importantly, the site was excavated as a paleontological site, and it was associated with construction, like highway construction, right? So there was all this stuff going on. And then the artists who published the site had gone back to these collections and looked at them in the museum, and then kind of came up with this idea that maybe they were modified by humans. Okay, so published in Nature, I think it was. And most archaeologists do not find this convincing. And again, I don't want to minimize. I mean, these are real scholars who did this work, right? So, I want to be respectful, but most archaeologists really push back on this idea, because there were a lot of other potential for how stones got to the site, or how these bones were fractured, right? Including maybe construction equipment driving over the site.
That seems to be the most obvious explanation.
Yeah. So let's say, for the sake of argument, though, that Cerruti is evidence of 130,000-year-old people at the site. Who would they have been? They were probably not anatomically modern Homo sapiens, because the earliest migrations, the major migration out of Africa, really predated or postdated that, right? So had to have been another kind of human, like Neanderthals or Denisovans or whoever. So we don't see any other evidence of them, right? So even assuming, for the sake of argument, there was some kind of archaic human at this site 130,000 years ago, that does not mean that indigenous peoples of the Americas are descended from them, right? Because genetically, we don't see that. We do see evidence for Neanderthals and Denisovan DNA, mixture, but it's old. It's really, really old, and it's very limited, and it fits a pattern of this admixture happening in a population ancestral much, much older, and it's the same admixture event that we see with all other anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Eurasia. So unless you want to argue that all anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Eurasia actually originated in the Americas and then migrated across which unlikely, given that we don't have any archaeological evidence of people in those great numbers, right? So sorry.
Well, when I hear this argument, when Cerruti first came out, and it's usually people who are really big proponents of pseudohistory and pseudoarchaeology, they were like, well, this site's 130,000 years old. Therefore, our ancestors, because it's usually with other indigenous peoples that I'm having these conversations with, and they're like, so this means our ancestors have been here, for at least 130,000 years. And I'm like, well, if, and it, like you said, it's a big if, this is actually accurate that, people caused this fracturing, and that this is, evidence of people here 130,000 years ago, they wouldn't have been our ancestors. And the argument that I always get against Beringia and all these things is people tell me well, if we didn't actually come from here, then that just gives white supremacists and racists an excuse to say that, well, we were just immigrants too. But if we've been here for 130,000 years, that takes that away. And my response is always yeah, but if you're saying that these people at the Cerruti site were our ancestors and they weren't even anatomically modern humans, talk about handing the racists a really good argument against us, because now you're saying we're like a different species of people.
That's what I was trying to tease out in this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. We kind of got there in a meandering way, but yeah, and it's just not supported by the genetic evidence. It really is not. I mean, Indigenous peoples of the Americas have, a clear connection to Eurasia to, there's that. Now you can say, you can say perfectly reasonably, okay, there's genetic descent, there's archaeological evidence, right? But we also have these traditional histories and, let's prioritize those, or we can, or maybe people who were here are not maybe our genetic ancestors, but are our cultural. And so, you can make these kinds of arguments. And I'm very sympathetic to that. And I'm sympathetic to the white supremacist argument. I think white supremacists will find a way to denigrate.
Yeah, it's not like they ever needed complex arguments to hate other people. A question. So we were talking earlier about the headline in the New York Times, right? You could tell was not written by a scientist. And I see this happen a lot with popular science writers or the headlines for stories. They make it like a sensational headline and it doesn't really accurately reflect what's in the story. And it leads people to kind of misinterpret or misrepresent what's in that story. And I see this a lot. I get this article sent to me, a lot. And the headline is, "There is no DNA test to prove you're Native American." And, obviously, if you read the story, they're talking about you can't just take a DNA test and then go around claiming membership in a sovereign indigenous nation. Like, it doesn't work that way. Sovereign indigenous nations have criteria for who qualifies as a citizen of that nation. And it's not just based on I got on Ancestry.com and it said I'm 50% this, so now I'm going to run around and claim that I'm a member of this nation. But when people see that headline, "There is no DNA test to prove you're Native American," the takeaway is, that I hear anyway is, so this means DNA is fake, or that there's no such thing as a native genetic marker. And that's the thing and this argument gets picked up and promoted by pseudohistorians and pseudoarchaeologists to bring in all of the Solutrean hypothesis or the Black Olmecs, or they try to put out all of these different ideas. And I'm like, but the DNA doesn't bear that out. And they're like, well, hold on, man. This headline says that there's no DNA test that proves that you're Native American. So DNA doesn't even work. So I guess my question is there such a thing as a native genetic marker? Like, can you take a test that says this person has ancestry from indigenous peoples?
Oh, you're going to pin me down. Okay. I will preface this by saying, if you use the DNA from indigenous peoples throughout North and South America, genetically very diverse, right? So they have ancestries from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, from all over the world. And they also, many of them, to greater or lesser degrees, ancestry from the first peoples of the Americas, who themselves have genetic variants that are found nowhere else, except maybe a little bit in Siberia, right? So pre-European contact, there are genetic variants, genetic lineages that you don't see anywhere else in the world. And that reflects this history of, during the Upper Paleolithic, migration, populations coming together. Then during, at the peak of the last glacial maximum, it coincides with that, a period of isolation. And it's that these complex evolutionary forces that result in the genetic diversity found in the first peoples of North, Central, and South America. Okay, and that nobody else has that. They show clear descent from these Asian and Siberian populations, and that signal is very, very clear. So yes, kind of. So, and then some of the ancestry from those peoples is present in to varying degrees in indigenous peoples today. That is not to say that one can define indigeneity in a genetic way. And I'm adamant that you can do that, right? So I really follow Tallbear and other critics of using ancestry tests for determining who's indigenous and who's not, right? You can look at a person's history and their family's history and say, okay, yes, have some ancestry from these first people. Does that answer your question enough?
Yes, absolutely. So basically, for example, because I did, some of these tests and my maternal haplogroup came back as A2H.
A2H. Nice.
And from what I was reading, it was like the common haplogroups of indigenous peoples were like A, B, is it A, B, C, and D?
A, B, C, D, and X.
And sometimes X,
right? And that's kind of the sort of generalized, vague way of talking about them. Like now we can sequence and we can get individual lineages. So like in the Arctic, it's A2A and A2B, D4B1, A2A1A. Yeah. things like that. But sometimes it's just easier to talk about A, B, C, D, and X, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is that's what leads to some misunderstandings, right? Because X is also present in Europe. Right? So
I think part of the conversation and that Kurly's alluding to is that just because you have indigenous ancestry doesn't mean that you are part of an American Indian tribe that's federally recognized. So the argument is not necessarily that you're not indigenous in the sense that you don't have indigenous ancestry. That's not what's being said here. What's being said is that you don't belong to a community that recognizes you as an indigenous person. And so that's part of the hesitation, to put it mildly, among a lot of Native North American peoples that they have towards people from the South. Because in Mexico, for example, everyone's just Mexican. There's no such thing as Mexican Indian federally recognized peoples. They have communities that the government acknowledges as being indigenous, but there's no like federal recognition. And then you have all the people who are state recognized, aren't federally recognized, that don't have the cards either that say I am a bona fide government recognized American Indian. And so the conversation gets very complicated quickly. And so I would push back a little bit on this idea that just because someone is indigenous doesn't automatically make them Native American, because this is all based on also how you define terms. The way that I define Native American is anyone in North and South America who descends from indigenous people is by definition someone who is Native American. Now, whether or not you are accepted by a community is a completely different story. That's a political thing. And here in the United States, that's where the term American Indian comes in, because American Indian is a political designation that is used by the government to negotiate with federally recognized tribes. So I can understand where some people might say that, yeah, taking a genetic test doesn't make you indigenous. True, but that's only part of the story, right? That it doesn't tell the complete story behind what that actually means to say that you're indigenous or you're not indigenous, or you belong to a native tribe or you don't.
Speaking about these tests, what are specific limitations of these consumer DNA tests?
Oh, there are lots. Okay, yes. And I take your point. I 100% agree. My argument is it's not for geneticists like me, especially to be telling people that they're native or not, right? So like I try to stay out of that. But I think that this is a conversation I think would benefit from a little more discussion. I think people like me need to talk to, we need to listen, I should say, more. And I, saying that having just written a book about this, right? So, okay. So what are the limitations of ancestry tests? One of them is that when you take an ancestry test, your inferences that the test will make about your ancestry are limited by the database that they have, right? And so if
the sample size
and also where they have been sampled, right? Where genomes have been sampled. And so if a population has not been sampled, you are not going to get that. And you are descended from that population. That's not going to show up in your report, right? Necessarily. And then the opposite of that means that you can go to an ancestry testing company and say, as has been done, I'm Cherokee, and they will count your DNA as Cherokee, right? Okay, that's a whole thing to unpack right there, right? They will count your DNA as Cherokee, and then they will say, anybody who takes a test who shows similar ancestry to yours,
are therefore also.
Yeah, that is a true thing that has happened with one ancestry test that has marketed itself explicitly to people who want to claim that they are part of this tribe. And they will even give you a card.
Oh, wow.
And they will give you a card that says, yeah. I don't know if that particular company is still in business
shady.
or not, but that's shady. And those are the guys I like to push back against, because there's a whole group. They're like, oh, well, this group of people have said they're Cherokee. They're descended from, Cherokee ancestors. And here's their genetic, here's their ancestry reports. And, oh, you can show that you're similar. It's okay. So that's one whole thing. And there is a market for people who want to do stuff like that. I don't know if that company is still in business. I haven't checked on them in a while.
I hope not.
Yeah, I don't know. I should check. That's a limitation. Another limitation is for most of these companies, when they return results, they're comparing your DNA to the database of genetic variation in population as they are today. Okay, that may or may not be true when your ancestors were there, right? That may not be what the genetic variation was like, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, however long you're going to go back. It might be, in many cases it is, but in some cases it may not be. So unless they're explicitly including ancient DNA in their databases and saying, okay, look, here is a genome from an ancient person who was present in, let's say, Sardinia at this particular point in time, and that, you show that descent from that population that person's part of, therefore you have that.
Do these companies have access to some of the genomes that have been sequenced that come from archaeological sites here in the Americas?
They are open access public. I think the companies do. I don't know to the extent that they put them in their databases, right? I assume they do, but if it's
and people
public,
have a real hard time understanding just the concept of deep time. I find when I'm talking archaeology with people, like they don't understand. For example, I was a member of this Facebook group of amateur archaeologists. They were looters. So I joined just so I could like keep tabs on them and see what they were doing. Because what they were doing was they were also geolocating where they were finding this stuff and thereby like encouraging others to go there and dig up stuff.
Yeah.
And one of these people was claiming to be native. I don't know if, they're recognized or what, if they're self-identified native, but it was like Comanche descent person from northern New Mexico is what they were claiming. And they were posting pictures saying like, well, here's what I found on our land and these are my ancestors. And I'm like, are you sure? Because that's like an archaic point that you're posting pictures of. Those are not your ancestors. This was way before your people got there. And I think people have a hard time just understanding like deep history, how far back the human story goes. I saw a video the other day where somebody was making the claim that, well, yeah, during Pangea, our ancestors walked across the earth.
Oh dear.
And I was like, I don't think you're right, sir.
That word, I don't think you know what it means.
One of the other arguments I see made by pseudoarchaeologists and pseudogeneticists, I guess you could call them, because I doubt they have a background in either, is they'll read these stories that say Australian genetic markers were found in South America. Therefore, the real indigenous people of South America were Australian Aborigines who came across on boats and were the first people here. What can you tell us about those Australian genetic markers?
Is that part of the Kelp Highway? Or is that a different highway?
I haven't heard that particular argument. So what I've heard is, okay, so first, what we're talking about, population Y, which was this really shocking made by Pontus Skoglund and their team that he was part of out of Harvard. And what they found was that there was a genetic affinity, like a closer genetic affinity between indigenous peoples of the Amazonian region and Australasians. And there was this really strange, like they shared alleles, right, from a common ancestor. And so that's in addition to all what I'm going to call loosely first people's ancestry, right, seen in the rest of their genomes, right? There's this there are some alleles, some variants, genetic variants shared with people in Australasia. The rest is from, the first peoples. Okay, so how did that get there? There were a lot of debates about, was this a real signal? Was it an artifact of sampling or analysis? It looks like it's held up. It's still a real signal as far as we can tell. And so then the question, and it's been expanded. So it's not just Amazonian peoples now, we see coastal South Americans as well. So then the question is, how did it get there, right? And so, of course, the first immediate answer is, okay, there was a trans-Pacific migration by boat and they got there. But it turns out that does not fit the pattern shown by the genetic evidence. And for very complicated reasons, which I don't really want to get into. I mean, I can try. But this signal of ancestry is much, much older and much, much weaker than would be a trans-Pacific migration of people who then diffused across the continent, right? And it's also present in a 40,000-year-old individual from China. So what seems to be a more likely explanation is that this signal of ancestry is present, broadly in Eurasia, and then, it kind of Australasian populations receive it, as part of their ancestry. And then so do some of the people in that Beringian population, that ancestral to Native Americans. And that it just kind of, diffuses throughout the Americas, and you see it in some places and not in others. And that's just kind of a stochastic kind of random thing. Yeah.
So there was like a distant common ancestor,
yes. Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah,
okay.
That seems to be. Now, that's one explanation. There's another explanation, which is, also plausible, which is that group of people who came to the Americas before that big Beringian group did, right? So there were people in the Americas early, probably not 130,000 years ago, but maybe before the last glacial maximum, before the ice sheet sealed and people can't get back down. And maybe what we're seeing in South Americans is that signal is an evidence of admixture within that group, right?
Oh, wow.
That's a cool explanation. I mean, both of these are testable hypotheses, right? For me, what I would like to find out is, so we don't see the signal in the Anzic child, right? The oldest genome, right? And as far as I know, it's not been found in any of the other very, very few North American genomes that have been sequenced to date, ancient genomes. But I would like to see if it's there. I think that I would bet money that some of the ancient genomes from North America will have this signal, I would guess. So I want to see. That's one of the things I'm testing right now.
That's reasonable. I'm excited to see the results of this test.
Me too. I would love to see it. We're a little ways out from that, but you guys all
so nothing a la Thor, Heyerdahl type of traversing the oceans.
Yeah, I don't really buy that's an explanation. I mean, who knows? These are all testable hypotheses, and so let's go.
Well, and that's the great thing, right? Is if you have a hypothesis that you can test, then you can show what the conclusions are going to be of that. Just recently, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Anne Cyphers. She's a Mesoamericanist. She just she was able to recently do a study on the DNA of Olmec remains.
Oh, I should know this.
And she concluded that the origins of the colossal heads are Mesoamerican, that it's not Phoenicians or Africans or, Japanese. I've heard
Japanese?
Yeah, I've heard Japanese. I've heard Tibetan. I've heard African. I mean, it's all nonsense, but she was like, all right, I'm going to settle this. She sequenced the DNA. Am I even using the right term?
Yep.
Of this Olmec remains. And she said, no, that these are Mesoamerican people. They didn't come from anywhere else. This is evidence. And, this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but a lot of pseudohistorians just flat out dismiss her research and say, well, this is just part of a conspiracy to hide the true origins of the Olmec people as African or Phoenician or, whatever, the Knights Templar or whatever it is that they're claiming.
The Knights Templar is my favorite right now. I mean, her findings.
What's the equivalent of the deep state for academia? Is it deep academia?
Well, no, wait, we've got this whole dark academia thing going in fashion.
Dark academia.
Yeah, like in fashion and music, or mostly fashion, right?
Well, there's the intellectual dark web.
Oh God, let's not even.
But that's like Joe Rogan.
I don't know. Is he part of that?
Yeah, he was one of the founding members.
I'll say that her findings surprises me about as much as the finding that Kennewick Man was Native American. Not,
yeah, right. That was
never
a huge
Kennewick
one.
Man was going to be European. Never. I mean, I remember this. None of us thought that.
Yeah. Well, and then the original reproduction looked like Patrick Stewart, I remember.
Patrick Stewart.
I know.
And I was like, wait, so Kennewick Man was like on the Enterprise? I don't understand what's going on.
Really?
But like this gets to NAGPRA, and I think Ruben had a specific question about
right. So at the beginning of your book, you mentioned the topic of repatriation, and which refers to the return of artifacts and human remains to Native people through NAGPRA, right, which stands for Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which has been around for 30-something years at this point, right? And, as someone who is becoming intimately involved with this work of repatriation through the Indigenous Cultures Institute and the Miacangarza Band of Coatecans down in San Marcos, Texas, I was curious if you could tell us a little bit how NAGPRA intersects with your work as a geneticist.
Yeah, great question. So I am all in favor of NAGPRA. I think it needs to be stronger, actually, and updated. And I think there's a movement to do that. So that's good.
Yeah.
So I think, my feelings on this have changed since I was a grad student. When I was a grad student, I didn't really understand the issues well. But in doing work with mentors, including my graduate mentor and later and my postdoc mentors, and kind of learning and working with tribes, I have seen the benefits of NAGPRA and how important it has been to sort of redress the harms done by these collections and creating these collections and maintaining these collections of ancestral remains and artifacts and objects, sacred objects. And I think the fear was on the part of archaeologists and others that by returning these to their rightful, stewards, that would prevent research from happening. And I think that in my experience, the opposite is true. I think there has been more research done and more understandings learned from, it's just been done in better ways. And with the descendant communities and tribes being empowered to look through the questions they're interested in and say no to the questions they're not interested in, right? But a lot of my work has intersected with repatriation. So in some cases, communities have had their ancestors returned to them, and they're interested in then finding out what they can before reburying them, and using genetics as another tool for that. I mean, that's not true across the board, but have been really gratified to work under these conditions where tribes are sovereign over their cultural patrimony and their own ancestors. I think it's really important. So,
do you think that perhaps by applying genetics to human remains in regards to repatriation, if that might pose an issue with certain tribes that want to reinter remains, and then through genetics it's found that perhaps they're not necessarily descendant from those ancestors that they want to repatriate? And you think that might pose an issue in the future of NAGPRA in regards to reinterring remains?
Yeah, I think that's always a danger, right? So you can't make assumptions about what you're going to find out before you do the work, right? And so I think the onus is on geneticists to be extremely clear. Here's what we're going to do. We may find out an answer that coincides with your cultural connection, right? The genetic results may coincide with your cultural connection with these ancestors, or they may not, right? I don't believe that genetic descent is the only way to measure ancestry, right? Or even needs to be the priority as far as determining who gets to be who has a claim. But I mean, obviously, if you have two groups and they're potentially descended from an ancient population, and then they argue about what should be done, then it gets really tricky, right? Mm-hmm. And if one is genetically connected to that group and another is not, what do you do? I mean, as a geneticist, I'm like, I step back and I say, look, I am not an arbiter of this at all. I am an outsider, and I am not going to make decisions about that. Right? So,
well, here I'm also thinking about in terms of the academy, with going back to with Kennewick Man and that whole brouhaha. You could also have it in the opposite direction, where research institution can say, well, we've determined through genetic testing that these remains do not pertain to any of the indigenous people who are now currently claiming it, because they're not directly related to that ancestor. So therefore, we get to keep it for future research purposes. Yeah. Do you see something like that also potentially becoming an issue?
I think the pushback on it from geneticists like myself and other people would be to say, look, genetics is one tool. It's one way to identify connections. It's just one of many, right? I would never argue that, say, for example, let's say that Kennewick Man was shown not to be ancestral to the claimant tribes, right? But they have these cultural connections that are really strong and really old. And I would never try to make an argument that genetics should supersede that, right? Unless another tribe maybe came forward that did have a genetic connection to him, right? And then what do? I don't know. These are really tough questions. I don't think that non-native geneticists should be the ones making these calls. That's my argument. And so, or archaeologists necessarily. I mean, I think archaeologists can give really, right? But I don't know who arbitrates this, but I don't think it should be non-native people.
Yeah.
Here in Albuquerque, we're having an interesting thing happen where there was an Indian school here, and a gravesite was found. And most people knew about this gravesite. There was a little plaque that was set there, and it's in a park now. The city owns it, and it recently came back into discussion because the plaque was stolen.
Oh, geez.
And so somebody reported that the plaque was stolen, and this sort of brought it back into the limelight, right? In light of, set against the backdrop of all of these horrible things happening where they're discovering Indian schools and these mass graves and stuff. So to their credit, the people at the city have been really proactive with okay, we got to close off this area of the park, and we need to involve all the Pueblos and the Navajo people and all descendant communities, and we need their input over what is going to happen. So now it's like this, what's the next step? And what do the native communities actually want to happen? Do they want repatriation, or do they want it left alone? Do they, so it's really interesting to see this happen in real time, because, I'm curious, like, wow, this is what is going to happen, because so many different tribal groups presumably could be represented within this single graveyard.
So sad.
And how does all of that get dealt with? So yeah, it's a sticky situation, but luckily the city's being really respectful about it. And, I'm hopefully, there's a mutually agreed upon solution to it, because, prior to NAGPRA, prior to any of this could have gone wrong really fast, right? Like they could have just bulldozed through it.
Do you think that the climate of archaeology and my field has changed a lot in recent years in this respect? Or do you think?
I do. I get to see it, right? Firsthand. Just even because I've only been doing archaeology for like 5 years, and I was a stuntman before.
Cool.
So, but I was able to see, like, even just within that 5-year span, going to archaeology conferences where I was like the only brown person, and I'm not a young guy, but I was like easily the youngest person at these conferences. And this is changing, right? I'll go to, like the Pecos conference, and, it's slowly changing. I'm not saying it's like it's shifted, drastically in the 5 years, but I have seen it change, and I've seen all of these different perspectives coming in, and more Indigenous archaeologists having a voice and being given a voice. One of the things that I did, the last SAA I went to was the one here in Albuquerque, and I made this sign that just said like #Archae of Color, and I went around and I was like, my mission is just to find archaeologists of color and take photos of them holding the sign and like blasting it out to social media just to prove that we exist. And it's funny because I won't say who they were, but it was like kind of a big firm, a CRM firm. I was going around asking people to take pictures, and some of their archaeologists were like, oh yeah, hell yeah, let's take some pictures. And there was some European descent people, some white people there who were like, well, why can't we take our picture holding that sign?
Some Anglos.
Yeah. And their own, the people who worked for the same company as them were like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, read it. And they actually got offended. They're like, well, I think that's kind of racist that you're carrying this, so there's still work to be done for sure. But I do see the perspective starting to change as more and more people, like, I know Joe Iracheta.
Oh yeah. I love Joe.
Yeah. So he's doing his work, which is awesome work. He has his group of Indigenous geneticists that are doing their stuff. We have like really good Indigenous archaeologists coming up. But it's like anything. It'll take time. But it's encouraging to see that this change is actually happening.
Well, speaking of which, I have a bone to pick with you, Jennifer.
Uh-oh.
A bone?
A bone.
Yeah. That's my segue.
Archaeology.
Yeah. So, to paraphrase your Indigenous anthropologist friend, why are you so obsessed with history?
I love her. I'm not just...
or phrased another way, why you hate history so much? You rag on history a lot in your book, and I was wondering, I'm like,
wait,
what books is she reading?
I didn't think I did. Where I'm saying that they're not that.
Yes, because
yeah. No, you know what?
The field of history has changed a lot.
Yeah. And I think that's reflecting my own ignorance as of a history of science and history of history, right? Yeah, you are right. I did history and injustice there. And I can only explain it by saying that, I'm looking at textbooks that are coming out of high schools, and they're not, the ones I saw anyway, were not good. Okay.
Well,
but I know that historians are much, much better.
Were all these textbooks out of Texas?
Probably, to be honest.
Wait a minute.
But I would not. So I was writing about this. I'm like, okay, where do we learn our history if we're not historians, right? I'm not arguing against historians. I love historians. When I was like, okay, where do we learn our history, right? And we learn it in high school, most of it, like the formative years, right? Unless you go on to college and study it. And so I went and looked at history books for high schools. And yeah, there's some stuff about, pre-contact, but it's really not enough. And I was disappointed. And then I got mad and wrote a bit of a about that's the origin of it. And I fully accept that I definitely did not do justice.
Yeah, because the field of history, sure, it used to be racist, it used to be very Eurocentric, but just like anything, it changes with the times. And that's one of the lessons that I tell my students is that history is not static. It's a field of study that changes and that is reflective of our current moment. Because the ultimate question in history is not just who, what, when, where, but why. In other words, so what? Why is this important to us? And it's important to us because it says something about who we are in the present moment. And so post the civil rights movement, especially going into the late 60s into the early 70s, the field of American history in general just started to shift. And that's when you begin to get calls for African American history, Asian history, Chicano history, things like that. And all those different trends that emerged from the quote unquote post civil rights era, all those informed future histories. And so by the time you get into the 80s and especially into the 90s, history has become more balanced and less racist and more inclusive in general. I would encourage all the listeners out there to seek out actual monographs written by historians. If you have any questions, you can hit me up.
I take your point, and I apologize to historians. I did not mean to slight you. It is the high school books that I was.
I took offense.
I'm so sorry. I am.
Well, that's okay. I slight historians all the time. Before we go, because we've kept you really long, my apologies.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's fun.
I wanted to know if you have a favorite example of what you called pseudogenetics. Like, is there anything
favorite is a loaded term. Okay, it's been a minute since I read his book, but Graham Hancock tries to marshal genetics evidence, and that's fun.
That guy.
We just did a Graham Hancock episode.
Did you? I got to go and listen to it because I've kind of forgotten what's in his book. But I did notice that as soon as my book came out, everybody's like, "Oh, she's confirming Graham Hancock," and I'm like, "The hell I am."
Oh yeah, his stupid book America Before, I think it's called.
Somewhere I need to go back and look at it. It's just
should that be its own episode? Just going through his book and just trashing that.
I'd love to listen.
Well, so. I think in your talk at Skepticon, you mentioned somebody had claimed that they had sequenced Bigfoot's DNA.
Oh, yes. Melba Ketchum. Oh, my gosh. I haven't thought of it ever. So Ketchum is doesn't she have a background in forensics and veterinary science?
I think so. Yeah. She's like a veterinarian.
And she's out of Texas, and she did.
Damn it, Texas.
My husband's a Texan. I don't want to rag on Texas too much. It's a great state full with lovely people. And
that's very.
And I'm a good example of that.
Yes, there you go. I lived in Austin before moving here. My husband's family, they're very hardcore Texans, and I love them dearly. So Melba Ketchum sequenced. She was given samples of hair, I think, a fur that was collected from Bigfoot's. And she sequenced them and published a paper.
So amazing.
I know. And she published a paper. Gosh, it was a while ago.
In what journal?
Wait, what? How does a non-geneticist have access to
that's what
the equipment necessary
I think Kurly knows the answer to this.
Do that? To sequence the genome of Bigfoot.
Well, I think she extracted the DNA herself and then sent it like a fee-for-service company or something like that, or something. I don't remember the details, but she sent it to Nature and Science, I think. I can't remember. Got reviews back, and it was rejected. And then she sent it to somewhere else. Oh, gosh, how did this go? She somehow got some reviewers to agree that it could be published, but then it didn't get published. Maybe it was desk rejected by the editor or something. I don't know. Anyway. No, I know. She submitted it to a journal, and they then went out of business. Anyway, she ended up buying a journal.
Okay. So it's in her own journal.
She ended up buying a journal, and if you go to it, there are 2 papers. I think only 2 or 3 papers ever published, and one of them is her Bigfoot genome paper, and one of them is like a review article that talks about Bigfoots in the Americas and the origin of Native Americans, I think. It's been a while. So yeah, what was that journal?
Bigfoot and the origin of Native America.
Okay, I'm going to do a Google.
Wow.
Because I got
that's a title.
Sorry, I'm just Googling here.
I'd be curious to see what percentage of Native American Bigfoot has in the genome.
Sasquatch Genome Project was what it was called.
The Sasquatch tribe.
Sasquatch. He's like, I'm 36% Cherokee.
Right?
Where
No
is
offense,
that?
Cherokees.
Yeah.
I'm having trouble finding the actual paper. All I'm finding right now are reviews saying.
Well, what's funny about the Bigfoot thing is I've always considered Bigfoot to be probably the least dangerous conspiracy theory, like cryptid belief or whatever you want to call it, because at least it just seems very benign, right? Like I'm a Bigfoot hunter, so I'm going to go spend a weekend in the woods with my friends and camp and look for Bigfoot. Like it seems very harmless. But I just saw a trailer to a documentary about Bigfoot hunters, and it's showing how like a lot of them abandon their families and they become obsessed with this.
It's a gateway conspiracy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it leads to some of these people are now QAnoners.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly. So you start with Bigfoot, and then you look at something like what's that ranch, Skinwalker Ranch, where they claim there's Bigfoot there, and it's coming from a different dimension, and there's chupacabras involved, and now aliens and UFOs and secret governments, and now you've gone from I'm going to go spend the weekend with my friends looking for Bigfoot in the mountains and drinking beer and sitting around a fire to now I'm storming the Capitol on January 6th. Right.
I had a dear friend in the Capitol on January 6th. It was really upsetting. Yeah.
Oh, man.
I know. So worried about her. She's fine. But it's called De Novo Journal, but it does not, I don't think she renewed the domain. Like I'm getting a GoDaddy.
Did you say Bonobo?
De Novo.
Bonobo
Journal. Yeah. I keep getting... I'm going to do another Google. De Novo Journal.
I wonder if we could buy that domain.
Probably could. Here, hang on. So, great podcast.
Refer to the listeners of Tales from Atlantis.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. I think that you can get the domain if you want it. So I guess she didn't renew. I wonder what's going on. So the Sasquatch Genome Project's what it's called, and you can kind of go to her website and see what the latest is. There's a lot of stuff. Yeah.
That's wild. Can you...
Yeah.
When we were talking about how humans mixed with like anatomically modern humans would mix with Neanderthals and Denisovans and just this concept of deep time and how long ago this happened and how it's affected us as a modern people, like, is this something that can be teased out genetically? Like, can you look at somebody's genetic sequence and be like, you got some Neanderthal in you, bro?
Totally. I have a lot of
That's
Neanderthal.
awesome.
That's why I have this, cranial bossing on my forehead,
Well, I have an occipital bun.
What?
And that's like a Neanderthal characteristic as far as I know. But I also have teeth. My teeth are shoveled.
Oh, cool.
So I just thought that was cool. Like I was explaining it, of course my kids are like, what are you talking about? Nobody cares. But I was like so excited. Like
you're part caveman.
Yeah. But like my skull, like the phenotypes, right? Phenotypically, my skull would not have existed, 20,000 years ago with the shoveled teeth, which is like an indigenous characteristic. And then having an occipital bun, which is a Neanderthal characteristic. It's wild. I think this stuff is amazing.
It's so fast.
And I'm glad that you could actually tell.
Yeah, you can sequence someone's genome and see, like you can see alleles descended that archaic admixture. But I think, I had a thought and then I lost it. So one of the really hot areas of genetics right now is looking at, what the functionality of some of these alleles, right? These genetic variants, like what do they do, right? So you have a variant in a particular gene that you inherited from a Neanderthal ancestor. How does it change what that gene, what the protein made from that gene is, one from a different population. So that's a really hot area of genetics right now. It's fascinating.
Can you even suss out like Homo habilis and stuff?
I
Or
don't
did we
think
not
so,
mix
no,
with Homo
I don't think they
habilis?
can do that. But I mean, they have certainly inferred the presence of other hominins who don't appear to be Neanderthal or Denisovan, right? And so like maybe that's Homo erectus or some other population of humans that's genetically outside the range of variation that we're familiar with. So
So dope. I love science.
yeah, I love it. I love it. And
So
some of these
badass.
are really functional. Some of them are, some of these variants are selected for, right? They provide a selective advantage in certain environments. Super cool. So
Well, thank you for joining us. Dr. Jennifer Raff, the book Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas is a New York Times bestseller. I ordered a copy. It's still on back order. That's how hard this book is
Wow.
to get a hold of now.
That's impressive.
It's flying off the shelves. Graham Hancock is currently purchasing every copy of this book. Him and Joe Rogan.
Graham Hancock has no idea who I am. He doesn't care. I sent you guys a PDF, didn't I? Or did I?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I was just like, I hope I did that. I hope I remember to do that. So,
Yeah, but I want the printed copy.
well, I'll sign
Right.
it for you and say, a thank you in it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm
Guys,
so
this was
excited.
fun. What a great conversation.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for being on the show.
And remember, the truth is like medicine. It doesn't always taste good, but it is always good for you.
Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timo Itase.